Whenever you sit down to read like a dense legal document.
Like a massive contract or something.
Yeah, exactly. Like a national constitution, a corporate contract, or, even just those endless Apple terms of service you blindly scroll past on your phone.
Oh, yeah. Scroll the bottom, hit agree.
Right. And there's this universal habit we all share with those kinds of texts. We completely skip the preamble.
We treat it like it's just, window dressing.
Totally. We treat those opening lines, the whole we the people part, as just poetic fluff. I mean, it sets the mood, sure, but you were just waiting for the actual rules to begin, right?
Or waiting for the bullet points.
Exactly. So, welcome to today's deep dive. We are really thrilled to have you with us because today we are taking that exact assumption about preambles, that they're just context, and we are completely shattering it.
Yeah, we're throwing it out the window.
We really are. We are looking at what is honestly a masterclass in civilizational survival. We're dissecting the second lecture by the thinker Ghulam Ahmad Parwez on Surah An-Nur, which is the 24th chapter of the Quran. And the detail that immediately grabbed me when I was looking at these sources is that Parwez dedicates an entire, incredibly dense secondary lecture just to the continuation of the very first verse.
Yeah, it's wild. Just the first verse.
Right. Like he hasn't even gotten to the laws yet. He's just stranded on the opening line deliberately.
Well, stranded is, it's an interesting way to put it, though. I'd argue he's laying a foundation that most commentators just completely sprint past.
Yeah.
Because for centuries, standard commentaries have treated this opening verse as a warm-up act, right? Like before the real content, the penal codes, the social statutes actually begins. But Parwez flips that whole methodology on its head.
How so?
Well, he identifies that this specific chapter, which is arguably, the most socially demanding text in the entire Quran, it opens by declaring itself faradnaha.
Faradnaha. Okay.
Yeah, which translates to, we have made it obligatory. And his argument is that this single word is the entire thesis of the chapter. It's just delivered in a highly compressed form.
So my goal for our session today, with you listening, is to view this text entirely stripped of religious sentimentality. Like, we are not reading theological poetry today.
Well, not bad at all.
We are putting on the hard hats of systems engineers and sociologists, because Parwez isn't reading this as a list of moral suggestions to make people feel spiritually fulfilled. He is reading it as the actual blueprint for an obligatory social architecture.
Right. And the implications of that word, faradnaha, they take a tremendous amount of time to fully map out, because it fundamentally alters how every single subsequent law in that chapter operates.
It changes the whole register.
Exactly. It transforms the text from, a collection of personal pieties into a hard structural mandate.
I want to push on that linguistic foundation first, though, because I know it sounds like we're just debating dictionary definitions here.
Sure.
But in classical Arabic legal theory, the root of that word, FRD or fard, it carries a very specific, very heavy weight. But for those of us who don't, spend our weekends reading classical jurisprudence.
Which is most of us, yeah.
Right. I'm trying to picture where this actually sits on the legal spectrum, because I imagine a tiered system where you have, things you shouldn't do, things you definitely can't do, and things you must do.
Yeah, picturing it as a tiered system is definitely the best approach. Because classical Islamic jurisprudence, it doesn't operate on a simple binary of just good and evil.
Okay.
It has these distinct categories of human action. So down at the bottom, you have makruh, which categorizes actions that are disliked or discouraged.
So like socially awkward stuff.
Yeah, things that might be unhealthy or socially clumsy, but they aren't crimes. Nobody's going to jail.
Got it.
Then moving up, you encounter mubah, which is entirely neutral ground. It's permitted. It's completely up to your discretion.
Like choosing to wear a blue shirt instead of a red one.
Yeah. Exactly. Purely neutral. Then above that is mandub, which covers recommended actions. So you are praised for doing them, perhaps rewarded in a moral sense, but you incur no penalty if you skip them.
Okay, so that's the nice to have category. Then you hit the red lines, I assume.
Right, the haram category is strict prohibition. That's theft, murder, those sorts of things. But sitting at the absolute apex of prescriptive law, way above everything else, is fard.
Okay.
Fard is the highest possible category of obligation. It is the one classification where omission carries strict, undeniable, systemic liability.
Wow.
So when the opening verse of An-Nur uses the term faradnaha, it is actively taking this comprehensive social code contained within its verses and placing it into the non-optional, legally binding strict liability bracket.
So that just reframes the entire document. I mean, it's stripping away the option for a community to say, we'll implement the parts of this chapter that fit our current budget or, what fits our political climate.
Exactly. You can't cherry pick it.
It reads much closer to a supremacy clause in a constitution. Like, think about the U.S. Constitution declaring itself the supreme law of the land in Article 6. It's a self-authenticating declaration that whatever follows is the absolute operational code of the society.
That's a great comparison.
Yeah.
And Parwez actually highlights another linguistic detail that strengthens your constitutional analogy. He looks at the word immediately preceding it, which is suratun.
Suratun means...
It simply translates to a surah or a chapter. However, in the Arabic text, it is indefinite. There's no definite article, no the attached to it.
Okay, so it's not this surah, it's a surah. Why does that matter?
Well, in classical Arabic rhetoric, that indefiniteness isn't vague, it's emphatic. It carries the meaning of a surah such as this.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. It implies a distinctive, unprecedented, incredibly weighty provision. So the text is literally naming its own structural register. It is announcing its own gravity before delivering the payload.
Okay, so if we run with this constitutional idea, the question immediately becomes one of liability. Because if I'm commanded to do something as an individual, say, I sign a contract to pay a mortgage, the liability falls squarely on my shoulders. If I default, the bank takes my house.
Simple individual liability.
Exactly. But Surah An-Nur isn't addressing personal banking, it's laying out a massive social code. So how does liability work when the command is directed at an entire society?
That is the crucial question. And it brings us to Parwez's distinction between individual fard and communal fard. And this is really central to his whole sociological reading.
Break that down for us.
So individual fard things like personal fasting or daily prayer, that creates personal liability. You alone are accountable for your own compliance.
Okay, that makes sense.
But communal fard, which is what implementing the social code of honor is, that creates collective liability. The community as a whole entity acts as a singular agent.
So everyone is on the hook?
Yes. The entire society, through its institutions, its economy, its leaders, is held accountable for whether the prescribed social architecture actually exists in physical reality.
Man, I see where this is going, and it is a harsh reality check. He's essentially saying it doesn't matter if every single citizen in your society has a pure heart and, individually believes in the rules.
Not at all.
If the society as an entity hasn't physically built the structures, the society is in default.
Exactly. Parwez refers to this as the necessary evolution of faith into reason, because a society cannot survive by blindly accepting these rules as superstitious dogma. Blind faith is brittle, right? It shatters under systemic stress.
Yeah.
He argues that faith must transform into intellectual conviction, which the Quran terms hikmah, or underlying wisdom. The community must deeply understand the socioeconomic mechanics of why a law exists.
It's like engineering. If your society doesn't understand the engineering principles behind a bridge, it doesn't matter how sincerely you believe the bridge will hold your weight.
Right. You can pray at the bridge all day.
But it will still collapse.
It will collapse. Which leads to a critique in our sources that I found incredibly sharp. Parwez looks at societies that have the penal verses of this chapter perfectly memorized.
Oh, yeah.
They know exactly how many lashes to apply for a transgression. But they haven't built the economic safety nets. They haven't built the accessible marriage structures or the equitable legal systems required by the text.
And his conclusion is?
He argues they have completely failed their fard. Memorizing a blueprint is not the same as pouring the concrete. You cannot live inside a memorized blueprint.
That is such a powerful image.
If your economic conditions make lawful marriage financially impossible for the average young person, or if your legal infrastructure is so corrupt that justice is just commodified, then simply knowing the punishment for social transgression is worse than meaningless. You have failed the collective liability test before the crime even occurs.
Okay, let's follow that failure to its logical conclusion, because this is where Parwez introduces the law of requital, or mukafari amal. And for anyone listening who assumes religious texts operate on a system of, divine favors and miracles, this concept strips all of that away.
It really does. It turns sociology into a hard science.
So what exactly is this law of requital?
The law of requital is the dimension of absolute impartial cause and effect. Parwez argues that the fard framing means the positive outcomes predicted by the text like societal security, economic flourishing, and the establishment of legitimate authority, or khilafah, they are entirely conditional on the physical implementation of the system.
Okay, I have to play devil's advocate here for a second.
Go for it.
Because this violently clashes with how most people experience religion today. Let's imagine a community where the infrastructure is crumbling, the economics are terrible, but the people possess incredibly pure intention. They perform all their personal rituals perfectly, they fast, they pray, they are genuinely sincere in their hearts. Are you telling me Parwez believes that intention, that sincerity, counts for nothing in the grand scheme of civilizational survival?
Relying strictly on his analysis of the text, yes, intention cannot override mechanics.
Wow.
The law of requital does not operate on sincerity. It operates on the actual physical social system that is running. The phrasing faradnaha makes the causal relationship explicit and mechanical.
So it's binary.
Yes, if the comprehensive code is implemented, the flourishing outcomes are produced. If the code is not implemented, the outcomes fail.
It's literally treating sociology like gravity. Gravity doesn't care if you sincerely believe you can fly. It doesn't care if you have pure intentions when you step off the edge of a cliff. The law operates impartially.
That is the exact paradigm Parwez is outlining. The sociological laws laid out in Surah An-Nur are as impartial and unforgiving as thermodynamics.
Yeah.
A community that performs rituals but ignores the obligatory social architecture does not earn the civilizational outcomes, regardless of how deeply they, believe in the text. They will experience decline just as surely as an unsupported object will fall.
Okay, so to understand how specific this manual of civilizational thermodynamics gets, we need to look at how it defines the core systemic threat it's trying to prevent.
Right.
Because the text spends a significant amount of time addressing illicit sexual relations, which it terms zina. But Parwez draws attention to a really fascinating linguistic sequence here.
He does.
When the Arabic text outlines this crime, it mentions the female first, followed by the male. And from a modern legal perspective, sequence rarely matters that much. But Parwez argues it is the key to the entire legal definition, doesn't he?
He does, because the sequencing is paramount.
Yeah.
It defines what the crime is by establishing what it is not. Well, by structuring the grammar to emphasize the mutual, simultaneous participation of both the woman and the man, Parwez argues the text definitively removes any element of force or coercion from the definition of zina.
Wait, so if coercion or violence is involved, if we are talking about assault or rape, it completely drops out of this legal category?
Entirely. If coercion is present, it ceases to be classified as zina.
Then what is it?
It is escalated into a completely different, exponentially harsher legal category known as facade.
Facade. And what does that mean?
It translates roughly to spreading corruption, tyranny, or committing treason against the state. So rape, in this systemic framework, is not viewed merely as a sexual transgression. It is viewed as a violent crime of oppression where one party wields power to strip another of their human autonomy. It is a state-level crime.
Okay, so zina, by the text's strict definition, demands mutual consent. It is identifying a mutually consensual act between two adults.
Yes.
Yeah.
And recognizing the historical context of that is really crucial, because in many ancient societies, and I mean even in some relatively modern ones, mutual consent either negated a crime entirely, or the legal burden and societal shame were almost exclusively dumped on the woman.
Right, the double standard.
Exactly. But here, the text takes a consensual act, identifies it as a profound civilizational offense, and holds both parties equally and symmetrically accountable.
And this is where I think a modern listener might feel a massive friction point.
Oh, absolutely.
Because if you look at prevailing modern secular paradigms of morality today, mutual consent isn't just a factor, it is the only requirement for morality.
Right. The dominant thought is that if two adults consent to an act in private, it's morally neutral.
Or even positive. And society, especially the state, has absolutely no business interfering.
The individual's right to consent is viewed as the ultimate trump card over any kind of societal engineering.
Which means Parwez's reading of this text is on a direct collision course with modern secularism.
A head-on collision, yes.
So, to understand why this ancient text views mutually consensual, private acts as a systemic threat that could literally bring down a civilization, we have to look at the data. And this is what I love about this source material. Parwez doesn't just lean on theological authority and say, God said so, end of discussion.
No, he doesn't do that at all.
He brings an empirical, historical proof.
He does. The primary proof he utilizes is this monumental sociological study conducted by a British social anthropologist named J.D. Unwin.
Unwin, yeah.
He published a book in 1934 titled Sex and Culture.
I really want to dig into Unwin because the sheer scale of his research is staggering. We aren't talking about, a survey of a few college students on a modern campus.
No, not even close.
Unwin studied 80 different primitive tribes and 16 distinct historical civilizations. We're talking the Babylonians, the Romans, the Anglo-Saxons, the Moors. This spans over 5,000 years of recorded human history. And from what I understand, Unwin wasn't some theologian trying to prove a religious point, right?
Not at all. He was operating in a post-Freudian intellectual environment in the 1920s and 30s.
Okay.
And many scholars suspect Unwin initially expected his data to actually prove the Freudian idea. The idea that sexual liberation and throwing off oppressive norms would lead to happier, healthier, more productive societies.
That releasing the repression would be a good thing.
Exactly. But instead, the historical data forced him into a completely different, mathematically precise, and frankly, a very unpopular conclusion.
I'm struggling with the methodology, though, just a bit. How does a 1930s anthropologist measure something as abstract as the success of a civilization across 5,000 years of totally different cultures? Like, how do you compare Babylon to the Anglo-Saxons?
It's a great question. Unwin developed a very specific metric that he called civilizational energy.
Civilizational energy?
Yes, and he categorized societies based on their cultural output into different tiers. So at the lowest level were what he called zoistic societies.
Zoistic. Like
Yeah, related to basic animal survival. These societies were entirely reactive, just surviving day to day.
Yeah.
Above them were monistic and deistic societies, which had enough energy to build tombs and temples and have rudimentary organization.
Okay.
But at the very top were rationalistic societies.
And what defines a rationalistic society?
These were civilizations that demonstrated the capacity for complex scientific inquiry, expansive rational thought, advanced engineering, and complex equitable social organization.
Okay, so that's the output. What did he measure it against?
He measured this output against their sexual regulations, specifically how strictly they enforced premarital chastity and absolute monogamy.
And what was the correlation? Like, what is the actual equation he discovered?
The correlation was absolute and undeniable across all 5,000 years of data. Unwin discovered that when a society practices strict monogamy and heavily limits premarital sexual opportunity, it acts like a pressure cooker.
A pressure cooker.
Right. It channels fundamental, autonomous human biological drives away from immediate, localized gratification. And that unspent biological energy is sublimated or redirected into building the society.
Oh, wow.
It generates the immense civilizational energy required to reach that rationalistic tier.
So strict rules equal intellectual and cultural expansion.
Exactly.
But the real test of any scientific theory is what happens when you alter the variables, right?
Mm-hmm.
What happens in Unwin's data when a highly advanced rationalistic society decides they're sophisticated enough to, loosen those rules?
The energy dissipates, and it happens with terrifying speed.
Really? How fast?
Unwin noted that when a society increases the opportunities for illicit relations and normalizes sexual freedom based purely on consent, that civilizational energy bleeds out. Within just a few generations, often roughly a single century, a society that abandons strict sexual ethics loses its intellectual output.
A century? That's nothing in historical terms.
It's a blink of an eye. Its scientific edge blunts, its capacity for complex, rational self-governance collapses, and it falls from the rationalistic tier back down to a purely reactive, superstitious state. It bleeds out all its forward momentum.
Think about the thermodynamics analogy we used earlier. Human biological drive is the steam. The social regulations of a society are the valve.
Right.
If you leave the valve wide open, the steam escapes into the air. You might feel a nice warm breeze for a moment, but the engine completely stops running.
Exactly.
But if you close the valve, the steam builds immense pressure, and that pressure drives the pistons of civilization forward.
That is perfectly stated. Unwin proved empirically that you cannot have a society that is both completely sexually liberated and highly rationalistic and culturally expansive for more than a very brief transitional period. The two states are literally mutually exclusive in the historical record.
And this is where the genius of Parwez's synthesis really comes in for me. He looks at Unwin's 1934 empirical data, and he overlays it onto the 7th century text of Surah An-Nur.
He bridges them beautifully.
The Quran wasn't making arbitrary, prudish theological rules just to make human beings miserable. Parwez is arguing it was legislating the exact sociological equation Unwin would later discover. It was codifying the precise pressure cooker formula required to keep a civilization from collapsing in on itself.
The text recognized, long before modern anthropology existed, that human sexual desire is a profound, autonomous biological force. It is not a casual hobby that can be managed lightly. Therefore, Surah An-Nur is not just a list of punishments. It is a meticulously engineered master plan for managing and sublimating that civilizational energy.
But practically speaking, you can't just hand a population a book that says don't do this and expect it to work.
No, of course not.
Because human willpower is notoriously weak. If this text is a systems engineering manual, how does it actually propose managing that energy on a daily basis?
This brings us to the architecture of defense outlined in the source, specifically how the text combats a concept it calls Fawahish.
Fawahish. Now, that's one of those terms that usually gets translated lazily as obscenity or lewdness, right?
Right, yeah. But that's a really lazy translation.
How so? Because Parwez gives it a much more systemic definition, doesn't he?
He defines Fawahish not just as the physical act of transgression or a dirty word. He defines it as an umbrella term for absolutely anything in a society's environment that artificially inflames biological urges.
Okay, he uses some really vivid examples in his lecture for this.
Geeked up.
He points to suggestive literature, provocative media, certain types of music, basically anything deliberately engineered to bypass the rational intellect and directly trigger the autonomous biological response.
And he makes an incredibly astute psychological observation here, one that feels very, very relevant today.
What's that?
You cannot flood a society with biological triggers. You cannot saturate the environment with Fawahish and then expect individuals to simply rely on their personal willpower to avoid transgression.
Because willpower runs out.
Willpower is a finite cognitive resource. It gets depleted throughout the day. It's called decision fatigue. But biological urges, they are autonomous. They are like hunger or thirst.
Oh, I see.
If you are locked in a bakery and constantly exposed to the smell of fresh bread, eventually you will eat, no matter how ironclad your willpower is.
Let's take that a step further. It's like a government pumping a highly flammable, invisible gas into a closed room and then sticking a tiny sign on the wall that says, please use your willpower not to light a match.
That is exactly.
It's systemic sabotage. You are mathematically guaranteed to have an explosion, and then the government blames the individual for lighting the match.
That analogy perfectly captures Parwez's central thesis on this point. A society that allows Fawahish to proliferate, whether for the sake of entertainment or profit, is actively sabotaging the willpower of its own citizens.
Wow.
Therefore, before the Quran even contemplates the idea of punishing a physical transgression, it mandates a multi-layered preventative social architecture. This preventative environmental design is the actual FAR, the primary obligation that must be built first.
I really want to walk through the actual layers of this preventative architecture because it's a very specific sequence. If willpower is out the window, you have to engineer the environment. I'm imagining this is where a state starts putting up, like, physical barriers, strict censorship boards, or internet firewalls.
You might expect that, but Parwez points out the text starts much more internally and individually before it gets to the structural state level.
Okay, where does it start?
The first step, mandated by the text, is to lower the gaze. And he is careful to note, this isn't just a physical instruction to stare at your shoes all day.
Right.
It is a mandate for mental and visual discipline. It's the active, conscious choice by the individual not to consume or fixate on stimuli that inflame the urges. It's the first personal cognitive filter.
But you can't rely entirely on individuals policing their own bays if the environment is hostile. So what is the second layer that shifts the burden to the environment?
The second step is a broader directive regarding public presentation. It mandates that women, and by extension, the general aesthetic of the society, not deliberately display adornments specifically designed to attract sexual attention in the public sphere.
So neutralizing the public space.
Exactly. If step one is don't stare at the flammable gas, step two is don't pump the flammable gas into the public square in the first place. You neutralize the public environment so that people aren't constantly fighting their own biology while just trying to go about their day, buy groceries, or go to work.
Okay, you can sanitize the environment, but you can't erase human biology. The steam is still building in the pressure cooker. How does the system handle the natural, healthy drive?
That requires the third and arguably most structurally demanding systemic step, facilitating early accessible marriage.
Okay.
The society is collectively obligated, this is that communal fard we discussed earlier, to provide a legitimate, socially supported, and accessible release valve for those natural biological urges.
And this has massive economic implications, right?
Huge
Right.
implications.
If a society allows rampant wealth inequality, or if the cultural norms demand, exorbitant dowries and massive wedding parties that take a decade to save up for, marriage becomes a luxury item.
Exactly. If housing is unaffordable and wages are stagnant, making marriage impossible for young adults at the peak of their biological drive, the society is failing its foundational structural obligation.
The system is broken at that point.
It is. You cannot cap the pressure cooker indefinitely without providing the legitimate release valve. The society becomes complicit in the eventual explosion.
But practically speaking, there are always transitional periods. Not everyone can or wants to get married immediately, even in a perfectly equitable economy. There has to be a contingency plan.
Which is why the fourth and final step is the development of ifat.
Ifat, meaning
It translates to self-control or chastity, specifically utilized during those periods when marriage isn't immediately possible. But notice the sequence here.
yeah, it's the last step.
Ifat is the last line of defense. It is relied upon only after the society has cleared the environment of triggers, trained the individual to lower their gaze, and actively work to make marriage economically viable.
That makes so much sense.
You don't start by demanding extreme self-control in a toxic, impossible environment. You demand self-control in an ecosystem that is already highly supportive and sanitized of artificial triggers.
It's environmental design for moral success. It's literally engineering a society where obedience to the law is the path of least resistance, rather than an uphill battle against human nature.
Exactly.
And Parwez uses historical data to show exactly what happens when empires decide they are too powerful to need this environmental design.
Oh, he does not hold back in his historical critique. He points the finger directly at historical Muslim empires, specifically singling out the Abbasid Caliphate and iconic figures like Harun al-Rashid.
Which is fascinating because in the popular imagination, both in the West and the East, Harun al-Rashid represents the ultimate golden age.
He's a legendary figure.
Right. It's the era of the Arabian Nights, immense wealth, massive libraries, unmatched geopolitical power. How does Parwez look at that and see a catastrophic systemic failure?
Because Parwez looks past the gold leaf and sees the structural rot in the foundation. He highlights the historical reality that these elite figures, including Harun al-Rashid, kept hundreds, sometimes thousands, of concubines in their sprawling palaces.
Thousands.
Yes. And from Parwez's systems engineering perspective, this was not merely a personal, private moral failing of a king behind closed doors. It was a civilizational violation of the highest possible order.
Because it completely obliterates the architecture of defense we just mapped out.
It does more than that. By institutionalizing concubinage on an industrial scale, they were turning human beings into commodities. They were violating the fundamental Quranic or absolute value of human dignity.
They broke with the core rule.
They completely abandoned the strict, egalitarian, highly regulated sexual ethics mandated in Surah An-Nur, and they replaced them with the decadent, exploitative practices of the ancient empires they had previously conquered.
So if we plug this historical reality back in shady Unwin's empirical theory, the result is completely predictable.
Very predictable.
The data says that when you shatter sexual regulations, when you turn human relationships into a marketplace of commodified, limitless gratification, civilizational energy bleeds out rapidly.
The law of requital kicks in, and that is exactly what Parwez observes happening to the Abbasids and subsequent empires. They lost their intellectual vigor. The steam escaped the engine. They stopped expanding their scientific, mathematical, and rational horizons.
And what fills the void when a civilization loses its capacity for rational inquiry? This is one of the most chilling connections Parwez makes in his lecture. He argues that the loss of strict social discipline directly caused the descent into superstition.
It is a profound, albeit counterintuitive, sociological insight.
Explain that connection, because it doesn't seem obvious at first.
Well, when a society is intellectually energized, when the pressure cooker is working, it understands cause and effect. It understands that if a bridge collapses, it is a failure of structural engineering, not the wrath of angry river spirits.
Right.
It understands that if an economy fails, it's a failure of policy. But when that civilizational energy dissipates due to the loosening of social regulations, the society's collective intellect degrades. They literally stop understanding the mechanics of their own reality.
So instead of figuring out the math to fix the engineering problem, they start worshiping the river.
Precisely. Parwez details how this civilizational exhaustion led the Muslim world to turn en masse to superstition. They began worshiping at tombs, relying on amulets and talismans to cure diseases, and attributing natural and sociological phenomena to magical, unseen forces.
That's a huge regression.
They lost the rational capacity to look in the mirror and say, our society is failing because we abandoned the economic and social obligations of our constitutional blueprint. Instead, they said, our society is failing because the stars are misaligned, or because we haven't performed the right esoteric rituals.
Wow.
The loss of strict social architecture directly caused the collapse of human reason.
Which brings us to the ultimate synthesis of this entire deep dive. Everything we have discussed, the linguistics of Fard, Unwin's energy equation, the environmental design, the historical collapse, it all culminates in what we can call the terminal sanction fallacy.
Yes, the terminal sanction fallacy.
This is where Parwez's decision to spend an entire second lecture on this single verse, Faradnaha, delivers its final, devastating verdict.
Because the Muslim world, for a very long time, has been hyperfixated on the terminal sanctions found later in Surah An-Nur, specifically the punishment of 100 lashes for zina.
Right. That's all anyone ever talks about.
It is the focal point, the obsession, of almost all traditional commentary and modern political discourse surrounding the chapter.
But Parwez is arguing that treating the opening word, faradnaha, as a mere license to apply the punishments, without first implementing the massive, complex, highly supportive social conditions those punishments presuppose, is a catastrophic systemic error.
It is worse than an error. In Parwez's framework, it is a gross inversion of justice.
Let's contextualize how severe this is. It is exactly like a state enforcing the death penalty for theft in a society that has no schools, no functioning economy, no jobs, rampant starvation, and a fundamentally corrupt judiciary.
Exactly.
You are enforcing the terminal sanction of the legal system without actually doing the hard structural work of building the legal system that prevents the crime in the first place. You are using the lash to punish an individual for failing to survive in an architecture that the society itself failed to build.
That is the ultimate argument Parwez is making. Surah An-Nur is not primarily a penal code. It is a comprehensive blueprint for a thriving, highly regulated, deeply rational society that channels human biological energy toward cultural and scientific flourishing.
So where does the punishment fit in?
The terminal punishment, the lashes, is only ever meant for the extreme statistical outlier. It is meant for the anomaly, the person who commits an act of treason against a perfectly functioning, highly supportive, trigger-free, economically equitable social order.
If the society hasn't built the environment, it hasn't fulfilled its collective fard.
Exactly.
And if it hasn't fulfilled its fard, it has absolutely no right to swing the lash.
Parwez's thesis is that An-Nur's single opening verse for Adnaha, we have made this entire architecture obligatory, serves as a preemptive condemnation. It condemns the practice of enforcing individual sanctions while ignoring the obligatory social structure, and it does so before the text even begins its content.
Wow.
You cannot demand the outcome without building the engine. The foundation question is simple. Is this text being treated as an obligatory social architecture, or merely as a set of enforceable individual sanctions? How a society answers that determines whether it survives or collapses.
That is a profoundly heavy realization. I mean, it completely reframes how you look at the relationship between law, society, biology, and the individual. Thank you for taking this intense sociological journey with us today. We've traced the path from classical Arabic root words to civilizational collapse, from J.D. Unwin's 5,000 years of data to the psychology of willpower and environmental design.
It's a testament to how deeply interconnected these systems truly are when viewed through the right lens.
As we wrap up this session, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over as you go about your day. Take Parwez's lens. Take this idea of the terminal sanction fallacy out of the 7th century and look at the legal systems and institutions in your own society today, right now, wherever you are in the world. Look at your prisons, your schools, your economic policies. Are your institutions genuinely focused on building the supportive environments that make human flourishing inevitable and crime incredibly rare? Or are they just waiting at the end of a broken road with a terminal sanction, punishing people for failing to survive in an architecture that was rigged against them from the start? Keep questioning the architecture. We'll see you next time.